State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable, presented by Cox Communications. And now, here's your host, Fred Morgan.
Hello and welcome back to the State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable. We have partnered with Cox Communications to talk about business stories and business issues around the state. One of the biggest issues to businesses is the labor pool and the skill of our workforce. We welcome back today to our show Commissioner Melissa Houston, who is the Department of Labor Commissioner of Department of Labor.
Yes.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Now, I know a lot of times you've been on the show before and we've talked about the role of the Labor Department, but today we're going to talk a little bit about this occupational licensing task force that you have chaired and just released their report. So tell us a little bit about why this task force was created and what was the problem that was trying to be examined.
Well, it is an interesting issue that I've spent a career in public policy, and it's a big issue at the national level. You actually have seen the Trump administration, the U.S. Department of Labor, is interested in addressing the issue of occupational licensing because there's so many. But interestingly,
what does that mean? What does occupational licensing mean?
So occupational licensing is a license to have your occupation. It is basically a permission slip from the government for you to work. And there may be some times that is appropriate. For example, a doctor, you want to make sure that there is a public safety component, a public health component, that the government does have a role in that. But you have some other professions that maybe not so much. And so one of the reasons, it's become a huge issue at the national level. And as I mentioned, the Trump administration has addressed it. But interestingly, so did the Obama administration. So for me, having spent a career in public policy, when you have the right and the left who both have said this is a problem, that is an area that is ripe for reform. So very excited to be a part of this. The state of Oklahoma has taken a unique approach through the task force, as you mentioned. So as far as how I got involved in it, as we mentioned, the Department of Labor has a number of programs. One of those is regulatory. So we actually do licensing. And as I got into the agency, I started asking questions about why are we licensing this? How many are we licensing? How much revenue? I mean, just asking the questions about does the program work? Well, it's one of those be careful what you start asking, because then the governor said, well, hey, we're interested in this issue as well. How about you head that up for us? So the licensing task force came about. Governor Fallon passed an executive order in December of 2016, and she put together a task force, which I know you were a part of, and appreciate your service on that. And we spent a year studying the issue of occupational licensing.
What kind of people were on the task force?
So, of course, the esteemed Fred Morgan, head of the State Chamber, was one of our key members. But it was really at a high level. It was very important to me that we have people who are interested in public policy at a 30,000-foot view. So it wasn't made up of people who were on boards. It was made up of people who are interested in public policy. So we had the State Chamber, we had nonprofits that represented the business community, and the poverty reduction is a big part of it as well. We had the Department of Corrections, because there's a criminal justice angle. We had OSU, OKC represented on there. We had 2 senators, 2 representatives. We had the Attorney General's office represented by the Solicitor General. So it was a very diverse group of people that, again, really wanted to learn about the issue and make some meaningful recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Well, this seems to be a bipartisan issue. As you mentioned, Presidents Obama and Trump have looked at it. Why do you think that is?
Well, it is interesting depending upon the sector that you represent. So kind of the more conservative view is we believe in the free market. We believe in letting the free market make these decisions. And if you are good at your job and you produce a quality work product, that the market will take care of that. And so you don't want too many licenses that are a barrier to the free market. On the other side, when you have too many barriers, you actually keep people in poverty. You keep people from getting a job. When it requires 1,600 hours to get a cosmetology license, and it's a lot of money to get those 1,600 hours, now you're keeping people out of the workforce. So really both the right and the left have some very valid concerns in this area.
And this is, as you said, it's a national issue. How does Oklahoma compare in licensing their professions compared to other states?
Well, there was a study by the Institute of Justice that found, I believe we were about 11th in burdensome licenses, and that takes into account how many training hours, how much money it is. But I think the reason this is continuing to grow at a national level, back in the 1950s, 1 in 50 jobs required a license. Today, that number is 1 in 3. So that is an exponential growth, and exponentially caused by the government, the role of the government, whether that's a state government, a local government coming into play. And so really all of the states are trying to take a look at this issue.
All right, well, we need to take a break, and we'll come back, and we might want to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court decision that kind of affects this as well. So
Sure.
Hope you'll come back and join us with Commissioner Melissa Houston. Welcome back to our visit with Commissioner of Labor, Melissa Houston. Melissa, we were talking before the break. There's a Supreme Court decision that kind of brought sort of a new attention to this occupational licensing issue. Tell our viewers a little bit about that.
So the case was the NC Dental Board case, and
NC being North Carolina.
North Carolina, yes, North Carolina Dental Board case. And I think it's important for people to understand that you have an occupational license. So as we mentioned, that's a permission slip from the government to work. It's usually not the state legislature. Usually they defer these decisions to a board, a regulatory board. And it's usually made up of people who are in that market, who decide who needs a license and how many hours and how much money it'll cost them. So in the state of North Carolina, they had a dental board made up of dentists. And in that case, there were some hygienists who started doing teeth whitening. Well, lo and behold, the dental board came back, made up of licensed dentists, and said, no, only licensed dentists can do teeth whitening. And that triggered a challenge, which made it all the way up to the US Supreme Court, who said, you can't use your role as a government actor to keep people out of the market. That's not an appropriate role. And a role protecting the public safety, public health, completely appropriate. But just to keep people out of the market is not an appropriate role, and if you use it that way, you could lose your antitrust, it's an antitrust violation, and you could lose your immunity to being sued. And so depending upon what state you're in, there have been various interpretations of that decision, but for most of us, it really became, what is the role of government? What is the proper role of government? Are they being anti-competitive, and are they serving to create additional barriers?
Yeah, and that's sort of the line, isn't it? I mean, it's important, and it's provided in our Constitution that the government has the right to protect the public health and safety of our citizens. But when it becomes anti-competitive to keep people from competing or having their occupations, then it becomes sort of an antitrust provision, anti-competition, and we see that at the legislature from time to time, don't we?
Absolutely, and the problem is really, I don't know if it's unique in Oklahoma, but it's certainly very problematic in Oklahoma because we have such a populist system of government. We have a very weak governor system. We have about 300 agencies, boards, and commissions. Many of those are not appointed by the CEO of the state. They are appointed through various methods. They're made up almost exclusively of market participants with very little oversight. And so you've kind of created that environment that is the very concern that the NC Dental Board case was trying to address.
Mm-hmm. And is this information about how many different boards and agencies are out there in government, is it readily available for anybody to find?
Well, it's interesting. The number of agencies, boards, and commissions are in the ABC book, the Agency Board and Commission book.
Which is this thick?
It's a pretty thick book that most people have on their shelves. But there really, outside of that, there really isn't a central place that you can go. And as you know, as a member of the task force, that was one of the first challenges that we came across, was people would ask us, well, how many licenses is the state of Oklahoma issuing? We couldn't answer the question. There was no website you could go to. There was no list anywhere of all the licenses because there were 300 independent entities who were issuing their own licenses with their own regulatory schemes without any oversight or accountability to anyone, really. And so our job as the task force was just to wrap our heads around what exactly is going on in the state of Oklahoma. That was a big challenge.
And as a result of that, you've been working on creating a database?
Yes, we initially thought the database would be a pretty easy thing to do, you know, just create a list of all the licenses and let that happen. But wow, I mean, we tried everything to get that data. We had surveys through the cabinet secretaries. We included it as part of the budget, the mandatory budget program that everybody has to use in state government. And even then, the data that came back to us was really inadequate. So we created a database, which is online, licensing.ok.gov, and that is for the very first time ever capturing what are all the licenses that are issued in the state of Oklahoma. The database is a phenomenal tool. It is sortable. You can sort it by number of licenses granted. You can sort it by the cost of the license. You can sort it by number of training hours. And for the first time, you have that information in one place so that the public knows what those requirements are, but also so the policymakers know. So when you hear stories about a cosmetology license being 1,600 hours and an EMT being less than 200, now as a policymaker, you can start asking some questions. But without the data, you can't start asking the questions.
And it's not just policymakers and the government knowing. I mean, if you want to start your own business, you may have a difficult time finding out what are the requirements to even get into that business.
Absolutely, and we are, there was a task force done early in Governor Fallon's administration that called for one-stop licensing, which is a great concept, and certainly the business community and many of us are supportive of that concept. But if you don't even have the data to put in that one place, you can't create one-stop shop. You have 300 websites that you're going to.
So one of the big things that the task force has been working on has been to create a blueprint that policymakers can use or we can use as a way to examine the whole licensing concept. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the first stage, as we talked about, is the database, just having the list of licenses. So now the question becomes, so what licenses are good and what licenses are not? And unfortunately, there's an inherent conflict of interest where you as a policymaker, I don't think you have your cosmetology license, I'm not sure, but you have to defer to people who are in that field to help you with those decisions. So is 1,600 hours too many? Is it not enough? When you see hair braiding, which as of a year ago required 600 hours, I mean, is that too many? Is it not? And you have to go to the people who are in that very field. Well, that creates kind of an inherent conflict of interest and really not reliable information. So what we wanted to do on the task force was create a tool that was objective, that policymakers could use in helping to make those determinations so that they didn't have to rely on the experts necessarily. They could rely on these series of questions. Fundamental to the blueprint, and this is why we've gotten so much buzz about it nationally. It was actually mentioned in a Fox News article recently. The Federalist Society has been very supportive. Fundamental to the blueprint is what is the role of government. That is the bottom line. If the government is giving you permission to work, why does the government take that role? And there has to be a government reason.
Let's take another break, and when we come back, let's talk about the elements, what the blueprint actually looks like.
Sounds good.
All right, well, come back and join us in just a couple minutes after this break with the Commissioner of Labor, Melissa Houston. Welcome back to our visit with Melissa Houston, who is the Commissioner of Labor. Melissa, you were talking about the blueprint. Try to walk us through that. What exactly are the the steps in this blueprint that you're talking about?
Well, in the blueprint, I'm extremely excited about. As you know, we spent an enormous amount of time developing the blueprint. We had a lot of lawyers in the room, so it is really a good, solid foundation and a good tool for people to use. We also did a public hearing and brought in public. So this has been vetted, researched, and I think is paradigm shifting for the state of Oklahoma and really a model for the rest of the country. So what the blueprint does is it basically walks through objectively 3 different areas that if you want to know whether or not we should have a license or repeal a license, here are 3 basic areas that you cover. The first is, why is the government involved? That's why does the government need to give you this permission slip? And what we found was there's really only 4 times that the government should be involved in that decision. Public health, public safety, a fiduciary duty, or a fundamental right. Other than that, there really isn't a role for government. The private market should take care of it. The next set of questions go to, is there a less restrictive means?
If a license is required.
Even if a license is required, even if you think there is a government interest, like public health or public safety, is there another way to get there that may be less restrictive? You could do a registration program, for example. In the roofing industry, we have issues, especially after natural disasters, and we want to use contractors that we know are reputable contractors. Well, a registration program accomplishes that public safety goal without rising to the level of a license. You could also do third-party certification. If you're looking to hire a human resources manager, there are certification programs that are done that you want to hire somebody at that higher level of training, they have that certification. So there are many, there's actually I think 12 that we outlined that are not a license but still provide for some level of regulation when there is a government interest.
And I know that the task force, one of the things that, maybe we'll talk about this in next steps, but one of the things that came out of the task force is before the government creates even more licensing of professions, and there are always new professions being created, that maybe they should walk through the steps in this blueprint before they create another licensing board.
Exactly, and the license blueprint really isn't even unique to Oklahoma. These are questions that you could ask anywhere in the country to make those determinations. So the third area is the role of the board. And that's where you get into the NC Dental Board case and who is on the board, who is making those decisions. Is it controlled only by market participants that encourage anti-competitive behavior? Do you have some lay people, retirees, or other ways to balance that?
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about the specific recommendations from the task force. So tell us what those recommendations were.
Well, I do think the database is very important. That was an enormous amount of work to get that information, and so continuing to have that is important. I know the governor is considering an executive order to actually complete the data. You will find in the database there's a lot of missing data because when you have 300 independent boards, oftentimes they don't report. So continuing that database is going to be important. Doing a second stage review. We have all these licenses on the books. Are there some that need to be repealed? Well, somebody needs to get in the weeds and start asking those questions. They need to go into the database, use the blueprint, and start walking through it. So our recommendations involved having a second stage to review that, whether that is a legislative committee that could be formed, or an independent commission or something like that.
Or a labor commissioner.
Or labor commissioner. There are many different ways that you can get there. We also recommended some things around reciprocity, especially when you're dealing with the military. I mean, the military is huge in the state of Oklahoma with all of our installations. When you have spouses who are coming in and out, having to start over at ground zero just doesn't make any sense and is not helpful. And
it's really important in some of the critical occupations we have, like nursing and some of those issues where you should be able to transfer licenses easier than you are today.
Absolutely. We have a number of critical occupations in the state of Oklahoma that we're really struggling to find workers. Well, if we're bringing them into the state and they've already been qualified at a high level, why are we making them start all over again? So reciprocity is another one. Criminal justice is another piece.
Yeah, let's talk about that piece.
Making sure that we're not using that as a tool just to keep people out of the market, especially when you're dealing with an older criminal conviction that may not be related to the license. I mean, if you're talking about a child molestation or a rape conviction and you're wanting to be an alarm installer, that may be appropriate.
And you might not want someone who's convicted of fraud being a CPA.
Exactly. So there may be some appropriate restrictions, but making sure there aren't just blanket restrictions that go across the board. So I think that's important as well. The other recommendations go around the legislative process. I think that these tools of the database and especially the blueprint could be fundamental to helping the legislature make those decisions. I believe there are, I don't know, probably close to 10 new licenses that are being proposed this session. Well, the very first thing leadership should be doing is let's make sure we're using that blueprint to ask the question, should this even be licensed? Is there a less restrictive means, and who's going to regulate it? So getting those tools into the legislative process. Sunset review is another one where if they're looking at whether or not a board should continue, they should be using the blueprint. How many, and using the database. How many licenses does this board issue? How expensive is it? And also in the revenue picture, that information is helpful.
Good. Well, we're going to take another break, and then we'll come back with some final thoughts and questions for Melissa Houston, our Commissioner of Labor. Come back and join us. Welcome back to our discussions and visit with Melissa Houston, who is our Commissioner of Labor for Oklahoma. So, Melissa, one of the things, the recommendations have been, the task force are out in the public, and I know there were some legislators on there. Are there some bills that are being introduced to try to implement the recommendations?
There are a number of vehicles that are out there. I know one of the things that the task force recommended, and as you know, it did not come from me, but from the task force, was to have the Department of Labor serve as that central point of contact for licensing.
Just to be clear, you're not running for election?
I am not running for election.
And your term is going to end in November.
My term will end, so this will not be an empire building exercise for me because I will be gone. But it was the task force who thought that the Department of Labor made a lot of sense, that there does need to be a central place that we can go to, members of the public can go to find out what licensing is taking place in the state of Oklahoma. So maintaining that database and eventually evolving into a one-stop shop for licensing. So you would have a central website that you could go to, that you could apply for a license, that you could pay your fees, that all of that would be tracked. And we're probably several years away from the technology there to implement that, but at least starting down that path. I know Representative Osborne has some legislation to do that. There are also some other recommendations that are being implemented, and I know leadership is considering how to incorporate the blueprint into things like the sunset review process, or when new licenses are proposed, trying to codify that in some way and make that a meaningful tool.
Why is it important for Oklahoma to be on a level playing field nationally when it comes to occupational licensing?
Well, I would argue that it's not even being a level playing field, but being the leader. I mean, I think that we have a real opportunity here to look at ourselves and say, is this the proper role of government? If the government is giving you permission to work, why is the government in the middle of it? And the blueprint is really the tool to have that analysis. And if we use it correctly, we could be the leader in removing barriers for people to join the workforce, for people to earn a living, to support their family. If the government is going to stand in the way of that, we need to make sure that it's at that highest level of public safety that they need to be involved. So we could be leading and opening up all kinds of markets for our workers here in Oklahoma.
In a way, it sort of complements right to work in a different way.
It does, which I had the privilege of serving on that campaign as well. So very passionate about giving people the opportunity to fulfill their God-given purpose and to support their family in the best state in the country. And so we need to get out of our own way and make that happen.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you for your work.
Absolutely.
This may not be the sexiest issue in government, but it's vitally important and crucial to the business community. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your service to the state and to the business community. So
thank you.
I appreciate all best wishes for the future as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us next time as we continue to talk about business issues around the state.
Thank you for watching the State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable, presented by Cox Communications. If you have questions about this program, email the Chamber at okstatechamber.com. Set furnishings provided by Scott Rice, creating effective workspace from the floor to the ceiling and everything in between.